We're going to ease our way back to some football conversation. It's crossover Thursday on the Locked On Podcast Network. We're joined by Kevin Ostreicher from Locked On Ravens, and we'll talk biggest stories, biggest matchups, and get to some football talk on today's episode.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
The NFL prepares to move on to Week 18, still going as scheduled, and so do we here on the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm Jake Lisco from Locked On Bengals, joined today by Kevin Ostreicher from Locked On Ravens for Crossover Thursday, presented by our friends at PrizePicks, which we've told you about before. Just you against the projections. If you want to get one last regular season week in on PrizePicks, you pick 2 to 5 players and whether they will score more or less than their projection, and win up to 10 times your money on your entry, which you can get in 60 seconds or less. First-time users will get a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code Locked On at PrizePicks.com. Again, that's promo code Locked On. Kevin, as always, want to encourage our listeners to hit the follow button, hit the subscribe button anywhere you get your podcasts as we, on the Locked On Podcast Network, move back to normal. And maybe you've been there a little bit closer than I have over on Locked On Ravens, Kevin, as the focus has been on Damar Hamlin for a couple of days as that happened in a Bengals game. And, well, the Bengals players talked to the media on Wednesday along with head coach Zac Taylor. They are still very much processing what happened on their home field on Monday night. They also are aware that they are preparing for a football game against the Baltimore Ravens. And I think for both sides, the preparation for this game and all of the uncertainty around it is the biggest story. What say you?
Yeah, I mean, you have to kind of think of Damar Hamlin in this situation. Obviously, the first and foremost thing is that he pulls through this. So many thoughts and prayers go out to him and his family, and obviously the Bills organization, the Bengals organization too, and the entire NFL. But here we are now in Week 18. You know, you're right, getting ready to play a football game on Sunday. The Ravens and Bengals both announced this game's going to be played on Sunday at 1 p.m. So whether the Bills and Bengals game is a no contest or a tie or whatever happens to it, obviously, again, very secondary to the Hamlin situation and Hamlin the person. But even, John Harbaugh said that he made resources available to his players in the wake of this. And Calais Campbell, speaking to the media after Wednesday's practice, said, he wouldn't, really be shocked if someone decided to retire based off of this. And he would completely understand if someone decided to retire based off of this thing. I know Ryan Clark tweeted out that the next snap of football that we see is going to be such a scary thing based off of this. But I mean, the biggest story has to be on Damar Hamlin, because I think it's important to keep the focus there. And while we're going to see a football game between Baltimore and Cincinnati on Sunday, the Damar Hamlin situation, I think, is going to have an impact. But again, you have to think of the person in this situation, not necessarily the game of football or the player aspect of this whole thing.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It has certainly been a focus on the Locked On Bengals show for the last 2 days. I thought that Zac Taylor today, talking about former Bengals linebacker and current team chaplain Vinny Ray, who Ravens fans may or may not remember, he was kind of a depth linebacker for a long time, but occasionally pressed into starting duty and played some valuable snaps for the Bengals, has returned to the team as a spiritual guide, a spiritual advisor. And Taylor said one of the things he's taken from Vinny Ray is that, given that they have a game on Sunday, you can move forward as a team, but you don't have to move past the situation that's happening right now. You can do both things. You can both do what you do to support the human being, and as Joe Burrow and DJ Reader and Zac Taylor said, continue to prepare for a football game that they've got coming up against the Ravens. And my takeaways from listening to Joe Burrow and DJ Reader speak is that this is challenging. This isn't something that these players are just paying lip service to. You've mentioned Calais Campbell's comments Joe Burrow was asked if a player said he didn't want to play this weekend, how would you feel about that? Burrow said, I would support that. I would understand that. DJ Reader was asked if he wanted to play in the game this weekend. He kind of declined to comment. He said, I'm going to play. That's my job, but I'm not really in a place where I can answer that question. So I think that, and Burrow said his perspective on the game has changed. And he thinks that those conversations will happen more in the wake of this among players. And a big takeaway for me this week, Kevin, has been listening to those players and listening to what they're communicating. I don't think that there's much posturing happening right now. I think that there is a bit of a moment here where players are being vulnerable. And, DJ Reader said this too in his presser on Wednesday. This is a sport where guys are macho, right? And there's not a whole lot of expression of emotion. You see it occasionally in the throes of defeat or the passion of victory or whatever you want to call it, but not a lot of real expression of that feeling in your locker room. And DJ Reader said there's been a lot of that in the Bengals locker room in the last couple of days, a lot of expression to their teammates and how they feel about one another. And, a lot of these teams are really close. And so it's easy for them to imagine what this would be like and take this as a moment to reflect and share those moments with their teammates.
Yeah, and I think it's you're completely right. The teams are close, but I think the NFL in itself is a brotherhood where these guys on different teams they know each other. They're friendly. Some have best friends on other teams, and you heard Mike Tomlin speak about Damar Hamlin, someone who has known Damar Hamlin since he's been 12 years old. He said, this goes far beyond. Obviously you have so many within the Bills organization, the Bengals organization, and that's been impacted by this. But you have so many others across the league, players, coaches, everybody. And I think it's so important to, again, realize the fact that, and I know a lot of people do, but I think some, these are people. There are people behind those helmets, people under those shoulder pads. They're just like you and they're just like me. They have hobbies, they have friends, they have families. It's not about what they do on the field. The most important thing is who they are off of it. And I know that a lot of this has shed light on Damar Hamlin and just the incredible person that he is. But, going back to Calais Campbell, he did say, there's like a gloomy, sad feeling this week. And I agree where I think we're seeing raw reactions from these players. And I mean, especially from the Bengals. I know the Bills haven't had media availability yet at the time of this recording, but right now it's definitely not fair to put those guys up there right now and ask them, what do you want to play a game this week? Because they're still processing what's going on.
And I think quite a few around the league are looking to Buffalo, which to me feels correct. I know a lot of Bengals fans are upset about the outcome of that game. The Bengals, they felt, were off to a great start and all these things and all these football ramifications. But given what's happened, I don't see another way forward. I think that no matter what happens, someone is going to feel slighted. Someone is going to feel like it is unfair. This all started from a moment that was unexpected and unfair. So it kind of makes sense that what follows is unfair. It's just the nature of this incident, the nature of what we're dealing with here. But the game will go on, as you mentioned, Kevin, at 1:00. And it could be very interesting, I think. And so I do want to take the step, having acknowledged and attempted to hold the space for the Damar Hamlin health concern that continues as we wish him the best in his recovery, and take those baby steps back to football and get into some of that conversation a little bit coming up next.
But first, today's episode of both Locked On Ravens and Locked On Bengals is brought to you by BetOnline. And BetOnline.net is the number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, analysis. You can get all the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there. You have pro football, college bowl season, you have basketball. Also, they've got it all over at BetOnline.net. And if you love sports podcasts, you can find those at BetOnline as well. They're always the fastest and easiest way to get your betting info. You can head over to the website or use a mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts.
Kevin, let's do some football conversating here as the Bengals and the NFL are proceeding and the Ravens are proceeding with week 18. The Bengals and Ravens, I meant to say, are proceeding with a game as the NFL proceeds with Week 18. And one of the big questions to me is, what will this game count for? With the still unannounced verdict for what's going to happen with the Bills and Bengals game. As of the time of recording this, they still haven't decided whether this game is going to be made up, whether it will be declared a no contest, whether they're going to continue it. And I have to imagine that would impact the way these teams approach this game, at least the Ravens. So let me ask you this, because I'm trying to figure out why the Ravens would play their starters this week. And there's probably a good reason to do it that I just haven't realized yet. But as we were talking before the show, that there's two possibilities for the Ravens here if the Bills-Bengals game doesn't count. And that's the 5 and the 6 seed. And totally different story if we don't know whether that game is going to be made up. If the game is going to be made up, then certainly I think you have to play your starters to give yourself a chance to win the division. And then this isn't even a conversation. But if it's not going to be made up, and maybe by the time this goes out to the audience, they've made that decision and this conversation is obsolete. But wouldn't you rather have rest than, deciding whether you're going to try to go play the Bengals or the Jaguars? What are your thoughts?
Right. It really depends, I guess, what the team would want in terms of, do they value which opponent they play over getting their guys some rest here, especially their starters that have played a full 16 games or played a lot here. So you're right. The Ravens, if there's no game between the Bengals and the Bills, the only way Baltimore could have won the North is if Cincinnati lost their remaining 2 games. And since the Ravens lost to Pittsburgh, that was the only path. The Ravens had to beat Cincinnati and have Cincinnati lose to Buffalo. If there was a tie, the Bengals would have won. If the Bengals won, they would have won. If there was no game, the Bengals still win the division. So you're right. Now it comes down to, if that game is not played, the way the Ravens get the 5 seed here, the Ravens are 6 right now. If the Chargers win on Sunday and they play at 4:25, the Ravens and Bengals play at 1. If the Chargers win, the Ravens are locked into 6 no matter what. That is where they are. But you don't know that because the Ravens and Bengals play 3 hours before the Chargers and Broncos do. So how high is the likelihood that the Broncos knock off the Chargers? There are varying opinions on that. But I do think that for Baltimore, they want to get some form of momentum. It's been very inconsistent for them coming out of their bye week. I guess if they're looking to get into the playoffs and get into the dance, they're already there. But if they're looking to kind of go into it with some form of, hey, we were able to beat a team in Cincinnati that, look, Cincinnati's playing good football on the field right now. They're a team that's found their stride. No, it's not perfect, but they're a team that the Ravens, if they can get 2 on Cincinnati, because they obviously won that first primetime matchup, if they can go into this game against Cincinnati in Week 18 with some semblance of, hey, we're going to go out there and compete with our starters and make sure that guys are in a rhythm and a flow heading into the playoffs, instead of resting them and maybe they lose that game. That would be 3 of 4 that they lost, and all 3 of those being divisional games: Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and then Cincinnati. Maybe, to me, that's where you can say they need to find something, because offensively, the Ravens' red zone offense has been really bad this year. I think it went up to 28th from 30th over the last 3 weeks. They're still, I think, worse in the NFL in that regard. The defense has been playing great, but the offense, obviously without Lamar Jackson, you lose a lot. But they're only scoring 14.1 points per game since the bye week, while the defense has given up 13.1. So you want to find something. The run game's been fine, but maybe you want to find something pass game-wise, where Mark Andrews had 9 receptions for 100 yards in that Pittsburgh game. The next closest pass catcher was Isaiah Likely, who had 3 for 12. So you want to find that rhythm. I think that would be an argument for me. And then there's the whole other conversation, the opponent. Would you rather play the Jacksonville Jaguars, or would you rather play the Bengals? I'd rather play the Jaguars personally. I think the Bengals are a much tougher test for Baltimore, but I think for the Ravens, their mindset is probably, we're going to play who we play, and we want to find some source of momentum heading into the playoffs if they do play their guys.
And we've all seen what happens sometimes. And you make a good point there. I mean, you mentioned even before the show, 2019 for the Ravens, where there's too much rest as the team with a bye in the playoffs. And we've seen the Bengals go back to the Carson Palmer era where they kind of back into the playoffs, not strictly resting guys, but not necessarily, playing them at their full capacity and pulling them early and then losing the next week. And so I think most teams have seen that happen at some point, or many teams, I should say, maybe not most, have seen that happen where, you rest guys trying to get to the playoffs healthy, and then you just don't get out of the first round. And so that's certainly a balancing act on the Bengals side of things. And, we haven't really gotten into some of the nitty gritty in the matchups yet. And maybe we can get to some of that, but I wonder what the state of this team's preparedness is going to be. I think they've got good leadership. I was really encouraged after watching Zac Taylor speak today that, they are going to be able to manage this the right way from a person and football perspective, that they have the leadership they need to move forward in both of those categories and to be all right. And I think they have that with their player leadership as well. Joe Burrow and DJ Reed are the two guys I've talked about, and some other guys on this team that have been there and are very high character guys and good leaders. I do worry about the lost day of preparation. It was already a short week for this team. Joe Burrow, like I said in his press conference, said he wasn't able to even think about this game until Wednesday. And so Burrow's a guy that's going to be grinding the tape as soon as possible, getting ready as soon as possible. Most weeks, his preparation this week has been delayed. I imagine that's true for a lot of the guys in that Bengals locker room as well. And I wonder how that plays out, because you can see from an emotional perspective, and usually this is where we're talking about football matchups. And like I said, hopefully we'll be able to get to that a little bit as well from an emotional perspective, from a mental perspective. The compartmentalization I think every NFL team is going through right now affects the Bengals a little bit more after they were firsthand observers of what was going on, after we've heard from them. And so you get on the one hand, the unity, the galvanization, the brotherhood of a locker room coming together. And on the other hand, the hurdle to overcome, the emotional, mental hurdle to overcome to prepare for this week, the lost day, potentially preparation on Tuesday, which typically would be a player day off, but would be a film day on a short week. I wonder how that would impact things for this team. I think there's no way to know how that's going to impact things for this team. And so that is something that is going to be interesting to watch and see how this plays out. And I think that's going to be true all around the NFL for every single team. And, I've got heightened attention there for the Bengals, of course. Kevin, let's finish the show with a little bit of talk about some matchups. I don't know if I'm ready to predict anything in this game. But we'll see what you think about that as well, and make sure we hit on some injury updates to wrap up the show. We'll do that next. Today's episode of the Locked On Bengals and Locked On Ravens crossover podcast is brought to you by Built Bar, which is where you go if you need a delicious treat and you don't want to pick up the extra sugar, the extra calories, the extra fat. We just got through the holidays. I know I'm trying to be healthy to start this year, and those Built Bars are perfect for this because they combine that healthy macronutrient profile with something that's tasty and a nice little sugar replacement if you have those sort of cravings. They're covered in 100% real chocolate and have unbelievable flavors that we know we love. We know you will too. Coconut almond, peanut butter brownie, and churro, a few that I know I really like. And they taste like a candy bar, like I said, with just 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, and 17 grams of protein. You don't need to wait around to get a box. We've been telling you to go buy them at Built.com, but now you can get them at your local Walmart or Sam's Club too. So you can go over to Walmart, pick up a 4-bar box of cookies and cream, double chocolate, or coconut puffs, or grab a 13-bar box over at Sam's Club. So go check it out in person for once with Built Bars. Kevin, let's talk matchups a little bit here before we get to talk about predictions and how wise it is to talk about predictions, given the unpredictable nature of this week. The Bengals offense has been red hot. You mentioned 13 point something points per game allowed for the Baltimore defense since the bye. The Baltimore defense has been red hot. The addition of Roquan Smith certainly a difference from any time Joe Burrow has faced this team recently. The continued development of this defense with a new defensive coordinator in town. But to me, the Bengals have answered every test lately. And so from a football perspective, there's one strength on strength matchup in this game, which is the Bengals offense against the Ravens defense. And then there's whatever's going on with the Ravens offense without a quarterback. We don't know if Tyler Huntley's going to play. It's extremely unlikely that Lamar Jackson is going to play, who didn't practice on Wednesday. But the Bengals passing offense has been on fire, Kevin. And so that's the most fun football aspect of this game to me, is a secondary that's pretty darn good, a defense that's been getting after it, like you mentioned, since the bye, especially with the addition of Roquan Smith, seeming to elevate Patrick Queen's level of play as well. And meanwhile, the Bengals, new right tackle or not, clicking on all cylinders on offense.
Right. I'll actually take the other side. I'll talk a bit about the Ravens offense versus Bengals defense, and I also have another matchup on the other side of the ball. But for the Ravens, it's all about the ground, both aspects, run offense and run defense. The Baltimore has the third best rushing offense in the NFL right now. They've been really good. J.K. Dobbins, Gus Edwards is coming back. Both have played really well. They're averaging 5.2 yards per carry as a team. But in that first matchup, DJ Reader did not play. And DJ Reader has been one of the best defensive linemen in the NFL this year. He's made a massive impact for that Bengals team. So I'm interested to see, one, how Tyler Linderbaum responds to DJ Reader, because Linderbaum, I think, has had a good rookie year, but he has struggled against some of the more premier matchups. Quinnen Williams in week 1, Dexter Lawrence in week 6. Those are a couple guys where he didn't necessarily win those matchups. So I was excited to see those two go off in week 5, but obviously that did not happen. Now, on the other side of things, speaking back to what happened between these two teams the first time, the Bengals coming into that game were one of the worst rushing offenses in the NFL, and they still are, stat-wise, they still are right now. I think they're 29th or something in net yards per attempt. I don't think that speaks to it exactly, but yeah, the Ravens, I remember us talking on that crossover where we were wondering, would this be the week somehow that the Bengals rush offense did something? Because the first couple weeks of the year, it wasn't great. The Bengals went into that game in Baltimore and averaged 4.8 yards per carry. Joe Mixon was averaging, I can't remember the exact number, but it wasn't great yards per carry. He averaged 5.6. And P. Ryan had 5.7. So do the Bengals replicate that success against the run defense, I think, in Baltimore that has improved? And going back to the injury front, it seems like we're going to get Calais Campbell and Marcus Peters back for the Ravens this week. Hopefully that's the case for Baltimore's sake, because I think they've missed both of those guys. Quarterback-wise, you mentioned it, Lamar didn't practice on Wednesday, so I feel like they need to give him time to kind of ramp things up in practice before he gets back. But Tyler Huntley dealing with a shoulder injury. He's dealt with tendonitis ever since really the preseason. He's kind of that pop up and go back down a little bit. So we'll see. If not, it's going to be Anthony Brown, their third string quarterback, who's now on their active roster. So plenty of matchup storylines from a pure football perspective in this one. But I think, to me, I definitely look on the ground, despite, obviously, when you look at the Bengals offense, got to stop Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, and Tyler Boyd. That trio, it's always going to cause problems for any team. But for the Ravens, you got to have some confidence, I think, in Marlon Humphrey. But can the rest of the guys step up against that talent?
Well, and it's tough even when you've seen teams let their top corner go one-on-one with any of these guys at this point. I mean, the Bills didn't get very many snaps against the Bengals. We saw Tre'Davious White matched up one-on-one outside as he works back from his injury against Tyler Boyd, who is not known for his ability to win one-on-ones outside and gives up a touchdown in that opportunity. You've seen Jamar Chase and T. Higgins both do it against guys like Xavier Howard and other premier corners in the league. So that, in and of itself, like you said, creates a huge matchup issue. But when you look in the trenches, you talk about the ground game, you talk about protecting the quarterbacks in this game, always something that we look at when the Bengals play football. I think the Bengals are pretty good in the trenches. I'm excited for that matchup. You mentioned DJ Reader, Tyler Linderbaum, that, a great center prospect. Kevin Zeitler as well, a fantastic right guard. Really, that entire offensive line for the Ravens has come such a long way with getting some guys healthy, getting some infusions of talent at different spots. And Morgan Moses, the Morgan Moses renaissance. I mean, when we were looking at Morgan Moses as a free agent target for the Bengals, we were talking about how his stance tipped run versus pass, and it doesn't seem like it's really mattered necessarily for the Ravens. He's had a really good year, but you mentioned a great matchup there. And then when the Bengals have the ball at right tackle, it's going to be Hakeem Adeniji again, or so it appears. Last week we thought it was going to be Hakeem Adeniji, and then it was, oh, maybe it's going to be Isaiah Prince, who's on the practice squad, and they didn't call him up, and it was Adeniji in the end, and it was a big smoke screen there, and that was a big deal. As much as your backup right tackle conversation can be a big deal, but there's a matchup where, you know, the ageless Justin Houston still out there, right? For the Ravens, who continues to have a pretty impressive year. I would say Justin Madubuike has really come on, in my opinion, this year, and Calais Campbell is still the guy he is. So with those additions, or with the Roquan Smith addition, the Bengals have not been able to run the ball the last couple of games, and we don't know what would have happened in the Bills game. It looked like they were finding some success early. Leslie Frazier's defense tends to be a defense that adjusts and gives up the most in the first quarter historically this year by DVOA anyway. They're in the 20s in the first quarter and get much better as the game goes on. So who knows what would have happened in that game, but against the Patriots and against the Buccaneers, who both have good run defenses, the Bengals couldn't get much going on the ground. I imagine they would really like to get that going again before the playoffs come around and find some confidence in that part of their game. But you mentioned in week 5, that was a transformation point. That was the inflection point of the year for the Bengals offense when they started going back to shotgun almost exclusively. They stopped being an under center team. So I'm sure they would like to get a win. I'm sure they felt like they should have won back in week 5. The Bengals feeling relatively healthy right now. The Ravens, I mean, relatively speaking, for the last 2 years, pretty healthy right now. Quarterback aside, I know that's a big one to put aside, but, you know, outside of that, relatively whole, at least on the defensive side of the ball. And so there's some pretty fun football matchups in this one, even if Lamar Jackson doesn't play, assuming that these teams both play at their full capacity. Do you have any feel for how you think this game is going to go right now, Kevin? For me, there's so much in the air in terms of motivation, in terms of, you know, so many factors that I don't really know. I have no inclination right now. I think the Bengals are a better football team. I don't know what that means for Sunday. What do you think?
Yeah, it's so tough to say right now because obviously emotions are running super high for so many reasons, and there's so much unknown, both, you know, what's going to happen on the field as well as how these players are feeling. You know, I know for the Bengals, who this incident happened in their stadium, they witnessed it on the field firsthand. You know, that's super tough, and especially for a team that, you know, despite the fact they've been playing so well on the field, how much is that going to impact them? You kind of mentioned it earlier, where this could be a super big uniting moment for them. They go out and just run the table on every opponent, and they have this miraculous thing. Or it could impact them where they're kind of foggy for a week or two, or however long that may be. So, and I think it goes beyond even that, where it's, you mentioned also how it's impacting not just the Bills and the Bengals, but the rest of the NFL and these players who, again, with such a tight-knit community throughout the entire league. What is it going to look like on Saturday, on Sunday, when these teams get out there and play, and what is going to happen there? So in terms of this game, again, we don't, in terms of actual like on-field implications, we don't know what it's going to be played for. If by the time this comes out, do we know what happens between the Bengals and the Bills? Is that game a no contest officially? Is it a tie officially? Are they going to play it in some week 19 situation? We don't know right now, but for Baltimore, at least, it becomes, well, are you playing for the 5 or the 6? For Cincinnati and their seeding implications, they also have stuff going on for them in terms of whether the Bills game happens or not. So I don't know. I think for me, the most, I guess the tilting part in terms of whether the scales tip one way or the other is just how these teams respond on the field. But I think it's such a hard ask, especially with everything that's gone over the course of these past couple of days here, to know how these guys are going to feel on Sunday after a couple more days of reflection, a couple more days of practice. I think it's super early in this stage, and I think it will be for a while. You know, it's not, I think once week 18 passes, there's still going to be that reflection. There's still going to be these emotions going on, but there is going to be a football game on Sunday. So I guess we just have to wait and see how it plays out.
Yeah, that's where I am. I mean, I'm never a prediction guy, as people that have listened to me before know. I let James, who will be back with us soon on Locked On Bengals, in case anybody's wondering, handled the predictions for quite a while. But for me, I've at least usually had a feeling about, this is going to come down to this or that or another thing. I feel like this has been one of the more challenging weeks to have a feel for the football aspect of things, because it feels so secondary. And some people are apparently sick of that, and I don't know that I care about that. Hopefully we will get some good news as we continue to monitor Damar Hamlin's health. It looks like, those updates are coming. Things were positive on Wednesday, and we certainly hope they continue to be positive, and keep that the forefront of our minds as we take these steps back to talking about football. And it'll be interesting to see how it looks. Part of me thinks that there's going to be some muscle memory for these guys. DJ Reader said this too, and I think it was a good point. There's only one speed you can really play in the NFL. You gotta play full go, because if you don't, you're putting yourself at risk, potentially putting others at risk. So I do think that we might see that. We'll see what happens. Like you said, Kevin, we'll see what happens out there on Sunday. We've seen teams answer the call and get through football games after tragedy before. Obviously, some different circumstances historically, but we're going to see football on Sunday one way or another. And so we will keep you prepared here as the week goes on Locked On Ravens and Locked On Bengals. He's Kevin Ostreicher. I'm Jake Lisco. We appreciate you listening to this crossover episode on the Locked On Podcast Network.